Rabbi, we lost you. We lost you, Rabbi, for a second.
I don't know why. Yeah, okay, we're holding here in the. Let me share the Gemara again on the screen. But we're in Daf Chavdal and Aleph 24a. And we're discussing many different halachas, laws of haftorah. At the end, we'll go through the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, a few of the halachas, a few of the laws of the haftorah. At this point, we are learning about how come today we have a Sefer Haftorahs. Every Chumash, in the back of the Chumash is printed the Haftorah. The back of the Parsha of the week, you have the Haftorah printed. Many shuls have a Sefer Haftorahs, a book of Haftorahs with Haftorah printed in big, large letters. We don't have a parchment, a Sefer Torah written like a Megillah. What are the reasons for this? And what differences are there in the haftorah today because we don't have a haftorah written on special ink with a special Torah scroll, gvil parchment with the lines scratched out? What are the differences in halacha? And this we're all going to go through today. But one of the main things is that you're allowed to skip around when you read the haftorah. You don't have to only have consecutive readings, and like many minhagim is you add on at different times, different parshios, different amounts. For example, if it's Rosh Chodesh, and Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbos and Sunday, so on Shabbos you read the haftorah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, and the next day you read the haftorah of, and if Rosh Chodesh would be only on Sunday, you read the haftorah of Machar Chodesh in Shmuel, and our custom is that we add the first and last pasuk, first and last verse of the other haftarah. You have Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah has his own haftarah, and sometimes we add more psukim from the other haftarahs, the first and last one. And you're allowed to do it because in Navi you're allowed to skip around. However, can only skip around in Navi only from the times of the Gemara, only if the words and if the verses that you're skipping around to are close enough to each other that it's not going to take up time from the tzibur, from the shul, from the congregation, waiting for you to roll the Sefer Torah. If it will take up time to the Sefer Haftarah, if it will take up time, then you cannot skip around from place to place. Nowadays, everything is printed. You could just have printed whatever you're reading, and that's just fine. You could have even psukim verses of Torah, which comes from a different area, a different chapter, a different book. Not a problem. So let's read the Gemara inside.
23.
I don't have our article in front of me. Probably 23a2. That's my guess. 24a2. Medalgin benavi. Ve'ein medalgin b'Torah. When you read the Navi, the prophets, you're allowed to skip around. Thanks. Thank you, Mike. You're allowed to skip around the Navi from place to place, but you're not allowed to skip around in the haftorah. Yeah, 24a1 actually. V'ramini, and the Gemara asks a question. Here, you have the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Let me just bring up a illustration of it over here. Here's that's called Avodah companion on Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol had a very, very busy day. It would take over 10 days of preparation, over a week of you have to be sequestered, and on Yom Kippur he had extremely busy day. And in the midst of it all, he would bring karbanos. He would separate. Make lotteries, go into the Holy of Holies 4 times. He would go to the mikveh 8 times that day, change his clothes 4 times. He wouldn't sleep the entire night before, correct. The entire night of Yom Kippur, he would not sleep. He was not allowed to eat, even Erev Yom Kippur, very minimally, so he shouldn't become tired from the food. So the Kohen Gadol, of course, had a very full day. You can imagine Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol was Kohen Gadol for 80 years, was no youngster. And in the middle of the avodas, he goes out, and although this is a illustration not of the day of Yom Kippur, but the Kohen Gadol, where is it? Would go out and he would read. So I thought I had it here. He would read here. Here it is. The Kohen Gadol here is reading the Torah in front of the people. Here he's wearing the big dikuna. You see, it's a drawing from not the day of Yom Kippur, but it says the whole entire week before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would teach a shiur in halachas of avodah, service in the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur. So the Kohen Gadol is reading, the high priest on Yom Kippur, the Torah to everybody, and he would read. He would be skipping around a little bit. Let's go over here. First, he would read in Vayikra, in Parshas Acharemis, chapter 16. He would start off reading chapter 16, which is actually the Torah reading that we read today in Shul on Yom Kippur in Shacharis. And actually, the end of Parshas Acharemis is what we read in Shul during Mincha on Yom Kippur. So chapter 16, and then the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he would skip to chapter 23. Chapter 16, in the beginning of Parashat Acharemis, says it's a portion of the Torah which Hashem tells Moshe everything the Kohen Gadol, the high priest Aaron, would have to do in the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur. How many times he goes into the Holy of Holies, everything he does, etc. Chapter 23, it's in middle of Parshas Emor, when this is Hashem telling Moshe about all the Yom Tovim, all the Jewish holidays. And in the middle, he says there's a holiday called Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur tells you what you can do, what you can't do, right? Which is verse 26 over here until verse 32. You have to fast. You have to special offering to Hashem. You cannot. You have to also abstain yourself, afflict yourself, which that means not to eating, drinking, not to wash yourself, not to smear yourself, relations, etc. And the punishment for it. So also the Yom Kippur is discussed in Parshas Emor. So between chapter 16 and chapter 23, it's 7 chapters difference, and in the Sefer Torah, it's about 3 or 4 columns different between. The question is like this: the Kohen Gadol, he would read Acharemis. First, he would read chapter 16 on Yom Kippur in front of everybody in the Beis Hamikdash, and then V'ach Ba'asar, and then he would skip to chapter 23, and he would read about the holiday of Yom Kippur and the Torah. Isn't he skipping around? Didn't the Mishnah say that when you're reading the Torah, you cannot skip from section to section? How could he skip? Amar Abaya says, Lo kasha, it's not a difficulty. He is allowed to skip around. When is a person not allowed to skip around in the Torah when he's reading the Torah? This is when he is making an interruption. Because if you're moving the Torah from place to place, you have to roll it. It's going to take time. But when the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would be reading the Torah in the Beis Hamikdash, he went from chapter 16 to chapter 23. It's only a few columns in the Torah. And of course, in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohen Gadol, high priest, when he read the Torah, had a Turgaman. He had a translator translating verse to verse. So when the Kohen Gadol concludes the reading in chapter probably 17, or the end of chapter 16, when the Kohen Gadol concludes the Torah reading, 16, so then he has to skip ahead about 6 chapters, 6 prakim, which means about 3-4 columns in the Sefer Torah. So while the translator is translating every pasuk, verse by verse, in the Beis Hamikdash, so the Kohen Gadol is able to scroll the Torah over to the next part, roll the Torah over the scroll over to the next part, and therefore it wouldn't be an interruption. People will not get confused. And in the Beis HaMikdash was a translator because there were many people who did not know how to learn, not to understand. Even Rabbi Akiva, till the age of 40, didn't even know the Aleph-Beis. For sure, he never learned the Torah. And it was a common thing back then, unfortunately, that, there's a famous Yiddish writer. His name was Bialik, Nachman Bialik. A lot of schools written named after him, a lot of writings he wrote in Yiddish. Actually, interesting, many of his writings he has a Jewish heart inside of many of them. Certain Baalei Tshuva said they started off their journey, their excitement about Yiddishkeit started from some of Bialik's writings.
He wasn't anti-religious, he just wasn't from the.
And so he was, I think in his early years, he was anti-religious, he changed later on. So Nachman Bialik wrote that I wanted to make a generation of apikarsim, people which are deniers. And instead I made a generation of amaratzim, a generation of people who just don't know anything. Instead of a generation of those who know and have their own opinions about it. So many Jews in the times of the Beis HaMikdash were not learned at all. There's a big divide. And so there would be a translator in the Beis HaMikdash to translate the words of the Torah from the Lashon Kodesh, from the Hebrew, in a way that everyone could understand into the language that they spoke. And so the Kohen Gadol had enough time to move a few chapters, a few columns. Ask the Gemara, didn't our Mishnah teach medalgin manavi ve'ein medalgin b'Torah, that when you are reading a haftorah of Navi, you are allowed to skip around from section to section, but you're not allowed to skip around from section to section when you're reading the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. So during the Torah, you cannot skip around. During Navi, you could skip around during the haftorah. And how much are you allowed to skip around when reading the haftorah? Until the point where the translator would have to pause. Which seems to say a blanket statement that you're not allowed to at all when you're reading the Torah skip from place to place. So once again, we're saying the Kohen Gadol skipped around from chapter 16 to chapter 23 on Yom Kippur in the Beis HaMikdash because he had time. It was close enough to each other that he was able to go to the next portion, chapter 23, while the translator is translating the verse he read, but the Mishnah seems like he cannot pause at all. Answers the Gemara. Ella Amar Abaya. Abaya says like this. It gives you a different approach. Lo kasha. Let me tell you why it's not a contradiction. Really, in the Torah, you're not allowed to skip around from place to place. And in the Navi and the prophets, you are allowed to skip around from place to place. So if so, when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is reading the Torah on Yom Kippur, why did he skip around from chapter 16 to chapter 23? Kan be'inyan echad. On Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol skipped, he went from chapter 16 to chapter 23. Chapter 16 is about Yom Kippur in the Beis HaMikdash. Chapter 23 is Yom Kippur in the Jewish nation, in the Jewish home, and Jewish people. So it's both the same subject, the same topic. When 2 sections are read from the same topic, people will not get confused. Because they're understanding we're still speaking about the same topic. So therefore, in Mesechta Yoma, where it says the Kohen Gadol skips a few chapters during the Torah reading, it's because he's skipping what's not connected to Yom Kippur. He's just reading the Yom Kippur readings.
People are not going to be generalizing saying, oh, you're allowed to skip around because it's a
Correct, right.
In this case, it's the same.
Right, people are going, people are not going to say you're allowed to skip around when you read the Torah, because over here, people understand that it's, even if they see the Kohen Gadol moving the Sefer Torah to the next part, but it's in the same topic, for the same reason, on a fast day, which is actually in today's Chitas, today's Chumash, and tomorrow's Chumash, if you're learning Chumash and Rashi. So in the fast that we do skip around, first Aliyah is part of the Aliyah of Sheni, of this week's Parsha, and then we skip to Revi and Chemishi. And we do skip around because it's between Aliyahs. We only have to roll one column over. So it's not really, you can't even tell, that they're actually moving over from place to place, from chapter to chapter. And it's the same topic. Hashem forgiving the Jewish people for sinning during the time with the golden calf. So if it's one topic, you are allowed to skip around from place to place when reading the Torah. The Gemara says that sounds good and fine, however, do you have a proof from a Brisa, or is this your own understanding? If it's his own understanding, then it could be someone else could disagree. Right? So Rava could agree with Abaya, let's say. Right? So Abaya says you're allowed to skip around with two topics. If it's the same topic, you could skip around in the Torah if it's the same, if it's close enough and it's the same topic. Is there a proof from a Tana, from the times of the Tanaim? You have a Mishnah or Brisa to support you? And he says, yes, I have a Mishnah or Brisa to support me. Vatanya, because we learned in a Brisa, is similar teaching. Medalgin be'inyan echad, when medalgin ba'Torah be'inyan echad. When reading the Torah, one may skip around as long as it is the same topic. Uvanavi, and when reading the prophets, a haftorah, bishnei inyanin. You're allowed to skip around, even if it's not the same topic, not the same subject, two different subjects, which is our halacha today. We do that many times. We'll add on a part of a first and last verse of a different haftorah, even if it's in a different place and a different topic entirely. However, and in both situations, whether it's you're reading the Torah or rereading the haftorah, when you do skip around, when you're allowed to, it has to be close enough. And when you're rolling your Torah scroll, you're rolling the Navi scroll, that it's not going to, it's not more time than the reader will pause, in order that the translator would have to pause, in order that there shouldn't be tichat desibura, shouldn't be a burden on the congregation, on the public. Tanya idach, we learned in another brisa a similar thing, a second brisa teaching from these times of the Mishnah to support that you're allowed to skip around when you're reading the haftorah and Navi. Ein medalgin minavi lenavi says you cannot skip around from one book of Navi, one book of the prophets, to another book of the prophets. So let's say you're reading haftorah from Hosea, you cannot add on psukim from Tzanya. See here on the screen. That you cannot do. For example, Yeshua to Shoftim, because if you're going from two different books, people will get too confused. The Ritva adds on over here that also it might take too long to go from one to the next. Sfas Emes, the first Ger Rebbe, he writes that not necessarily, because you can have it in two different ways. Let's say you have the end of one Navi and the beginning of the next Navi, right? So the end of, let's say the end of Micha and the beginning of Nachum, or end of Nachum and the beginning of Habakkuk. But seemingly that would be allowed. It doesn't take up time. So that's his question in the Ritva. Or he says, Why don't you have two books in front of you? I have one haftorah book in front of me and a second haftorah book in front of me. And I can read two haftorahs, just like that. So the real reason that you can't go from Navi to Navi is the reason Rashi gives is because there'd be too much confusion. People will, not understand what's happening. You're reading this Zkainim, now you're reading Habakkuk. Like, what exactly is happening? However, of Navi Shneim Asar, when it comes to Terei Asar,
Tiferes is one book.
Terei Asar is one book, but has 12 prophets inside of it. When it comes to the Terei Asar, it's one book, but of 12 shorter Nevi'im. Some of them are very short, and some of them are like a little bit longer, but 12 shorter Nevi'im. Medaleg, you are allowed to skip around from place to place, from book to book, because all 12 of them are considered to be one long Sefer of Navi. As long as you don't go backwards. You can't start from chapter 11 and go back to chapter 2. That's within one book. And nowadays, when we do Navi, you are allowed to go in a different order. Meaning, even though, let's say, just to pull up on the screen here, even though Shmuel comes before Yirmiyahu, and the haftorah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, let's say it was Yirmiyahu, I think, or Yeshaya, and then we add on the first and last verse from the haftorah of Machar Chodesh, if the next says Rosh Chodesh, which is in Sefer Shmuel, which is earlier in Tanakh, that's not a problem because it's two different books. But within one book, within one Sefer, I'm not going to do the later chapter before the earlier chapter. You do have several haftorahs where you skip around within one book, and then you always have the earlier one before the later one. Halakha. Are you allowed to skip around in Navi today? So it all boils down to this thing: how we read our haftorah today. We have what's called a Sefer Haftorahs. We have one in the next room. Where you have a chumash over there in the back of every chumash. You have the haftorah. Now there is a isser, prohibition, to have any book of chumash or navi written as its own. It has to be written as part of a nach. Can't have just a chumash bereshis or just a parshas bereshis. Has to be an entire sefer, an entire book, altogether. The reason, there's two reasons given, and we want to look at the Gemara and Gittin here on the screen. But the two reasons given is, one is because Hashem, we say, David HaMelech says that chapter 40. I have come with a scroll of the book that is written for me. Meaning that each portion of the Torah is its own book. You can have maybe a whole Bereshis or whole Shemais, but you can't have an entire. You can't have a Parshas Bereshis or Parshas Noach, Parshas Lech Lecha. You can't have an entire one. Only exception made is if you're doing it to teach little children, and the children should know that it's not kosher, or you're writing it and you didn't yet finish it. The children could still learn from there. Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Hazinu, over Zayis HaBracha, it says, "Lakoyach HaSefer Torah Azos," take this Torah, meaning the entire Torah as one. So we see there's support to say that every book is separate, or the entire Torah is one long book. If a Torah is invalid, if a Torah scroll is, let's say you're reading it and you find a letter that's invalid, you have to take out a new Sefer Torah. However, let's say I only have one Sefer Torah, and it's invalid. And the Torah, and let's say it's Yom Tov, and the haftorah, so the Torah reading is a Chumash Vayikra, and the maftir is in Chumash Bamidbar. And if it had something invalid in one Chumash, in Chumash Vayikra, you're allowed to read the maftir from the other book, because one book, each book is sort of its own separate entity. Every Bereshis, Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim are all their own separate entities. So as the Gemara says, you're not allowed to have a book of Nach written on its own. A book of a Torah written on its own. All has to be written as a large book together. I don't need this anymore. So since it's all its own separate books, you need at least every single book written by itself. So a haftorah is usually just a chapter or two of a book, of a certain sefer. So how could you have a book of haftorahs written? You can't. You're not supposed to. And look at the Gemara over here, Mesechta Gittin over here, Daf Samach Amud Aleph. The Gemara itself already references what's called Chumashim, a Chumash, and a Sefer Haftarta, a book of Haftorahs. Now, there was no printing presses back then, so everything was written by hand. And instead of writing, you're in shul, you need a Haftorah book. Instead of writing an entire Sefer Torah, every book was precious. People had to learn, so they write the book of Haftorahs. So Rabbi Rabbi Yosef said that Ein Keren b'Chumashim b'Beis HaKnesset b'Shum Kavod HaTzibur. You cannot use a chumash in a shul out of respect for the community. What is a chumash? A chumash is where a portion of not an entire Torah scroll, just a portion, let's say one parsha, Parshas Bereshis, Parshas Noach, Parshas Lech Lecha. You can't use that in shul. And you can read from there. In addition, he says, if you have just a chumash Bereshis, and then just another scroll, Chumash Shemais, you can't use that because to honor and to respect everyone in the shul, in the congregation, the community, you have to have an entire Chumash. Rabbi Rav Yosef, Rabbi Rav Yosef will say, Hai Sefer Haftarta, Asur L'Mikrubei. A Sefer Haftarta, a book of Haftorahs, you're not allowed to use in shul. B'Shabbos on Shabbos. My time, what's the reason? Because you're not supposed to write it such a sefer, such a Torah scroll to begin with. You're not supposed to write a scroll of just a chapter. You have to write an entire Navi. So therefore, Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef say you can't use a sefer haftorahs. But what that means is that it was very common then, even in the times of the Amirayim, in the times of the Gemara, in times of the Mishnah. It was common to have a Sefer Haftarahs, and Rabbi Rav Yosef says you're not allowed to use it. Then there's discussion. Some say that such a scroll is even muktzah, because since you're not allowed to use it, it's muktzah on Shabbos. And there's a big discussion over there. Well, are you allowed to use books on Shabbos? Are you allowed to use Sfarim on Shabbos? It's all. The essential answer is to all these questions, and the Gemara says this answer about 3 or 4 times over there. Called Eislasis Lashem Efere Toresecha. That we're unable otherwise. Meaning we can't otherwise. It's impossible for us to do anything different than that. Like, for example, everyone used to stand when learning. Now we're all sitting. Why? You're supposed to stand when you learn Torah. Because the world doesn't have as much strength as it used to. And there's many, many things. Learning on Shabbos from a sefer. People used to know everything by heart. Nowadays, aside from Dovi's relatives, very few people know everything by heart. Like they used to. You just don't make them like you used to. And therefore, you're allowed to use Sfarim, which are written on parchment, which are not which are only portions of a Sefer Torah. So that's essentially the answer. Eis Lasses Lashem. Now, historically, especially in Jewish communities, especially in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, were very poor. Middle Ages, everyone was very poor. And if you see over here, this is X out of. I'm just going to bring up online right now. Here's there are some people today which use a Sefer Haftarahs. The Mishnah Brewer writes you should definitely use, if you're able to get a book for Haftarah, you should do it. It's actually very interesting. You call up someone for Haftarah, and it looks just like a Sefer Torah. So that means a person has to prepare the Haftarah before. So what they would do is it'd be sort of like an aliyah to the Torah. The Bakare, the one who reads the Torah, would read the haftorah, and the person would just say getting the aliyah would say the bracha before and after.
And read it off of the scroll.
And then the Bakare would read it, and read it off the scroll. It's like sort of getting an aliyah, except that instead of the aliyah being from the Torah, it's now from the Navi, from the prophets. But here's just a Megillah. Here's a sefer that I happen to know. It lives in Monsey. Just the Megillah, which is about 10 columns, is $2,100 to $3,500 for a Megillah.
Okay.
Right? The Sefer Torah could be $40,000, $50,000 for a Megillah. It's just not feasible, at least for definitely back then, for everyone before the printing press, for sure. When the only way to learn was from a written parchment, was to have your own Megillah. Here is a Sefer Haftarahs. It's on eBay. See Sephardi, it's beautiful with beautiful crowns and cases. And this is $13,500.
That's already cheaper.
Correct. It's a little bit cheaper, but this is used. Or maybe it is new. It says written on cloth. To me, it looks I don't know. It might be written, might not be written. I'm not sure exactly. It looks to me printed on cloth, but I don't know. I can't say for sure.
Is it being sold on Amazon?
You can find these on. I would not buy any tefillin or mezuzahs from Amazon or eBay. Only buy from a place where a reputable source, a cipher. To know where they are. There's nowadays, unfortunately, robots which could write the Sefer Torah. They did discover some non-reputable, probably not whatever people which they are hiring girls in Vietnam to write mezuzahs.
That is really disgraceful.
It's disgraceful, yes. You have to, when you buy a Sefer Torah, tefillin, mezuzah, you have to find the birth certificate. You're not just going to go to a garage sale and buy a original Picasso because the guy told you to say Picasso at a garage sale, right? You're not going to buy a sculpture because the guy told you. You have to be able to have a birth certificate for it. You have to know who the cipher that it came from is.
Yeah. I mean, I bought my wife a necklace which has a bit but that doesn't need to be kosher.
Here's another Sefer Haftarahs, 38,000 shekel. Not sure how much that is today. 38,000 shekel, but that's still probably about $10,000. So it's not cheap, but oopsies. But let me ask you, you have a crown of a Sefer Torah. A crown of a Sefer Torah costs a lot more than the book of Haftarahs, it looks like. People buy beautiful ornaments. Shuls cost multiple hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to build. If this is so important to have a Sefer Haftarahs, a book, a scroll of Haftarahs, why don't we do it? Our Rebbes, our Chabad Rebbes didn't stop at anything to do a mitzvah. To beautify a mitzvah and do a mitzvah in the best way, nothing would stop them. They go to any lengths and they would be stringent on themselves to the extreme. No expense spirit, obviously. Many stories of all of our Rabbeim doing it, all our Rebbes, paying for private planes to come, during the Russian Revolution to bring a esrog from Italy. You could have got a different esrog, but he got an Italian esrog from Calabria, and to bring it to Rostov, and tremendous amount of money, and they managed to bring 3 esrogim. This is in the year 1919 or 1920. They managed to get 3 esrogim on Erev Sukkos. So our Chabad Rebbeim, when it came to expenses, they didn't stop at anything. It came to expense, health, right, during the Holocaust, during the war. The Rebbe this is the year 1940, right? This is 1940, and the Rebbe was in France then, and the Rebbe traveled to Italy to get us the esrog, even though possibly he could have used a different esrog, right? The Rebbe traveled 6 hours on a dangerous mountain path to get an onion for the Seder plate by foot, right? And we could have used a different vegetable, used a potato, used something else.
Yeah.
So when it comes to a mitzvah, especially a mitzvah which is semi-affordable, right? It might be more expensive than the Sefer Torah, because look at a Sefer Navi. A Navi, the prophets, it's about twice as big as a Sefer Torah, right? So here, let's see. Sefer Navi, I haven't checked it up. But the Tanakh, there's 5 books in the Torah. Over here in the Navi, there's, I'm not sure, about 15 books, I think. Because counting Torah Asar as one. But Psukim, verse-wise, length-wise, is about twice as long as a Torah. Let's say a Torah costs you $50,000. So say this will cost you $100,000, right? So why not do it? So let's look a little bit in just a few halachas. Skip this, close that.
I heard Shiur Torah has a scroll of the nothing.
The Rebbe himself had one in his office. You can still see, if you go to the Rebbe's room today, you can still see it. They say the Rebbe used it on Erev Shabbos when he was reading the haftorah, like during Shnai Mikra, before Shabbos, you review the parsha. The Rebbe himself had a book of haftorahs.
Actually,
And a lot for many years, it was on the Rebbe's desk, in his room. But you need not a sefer haftorah, but a sefer of Navi, an entire prophets.
Oh, yeah, no.
You do have sefer haftorahs, but again, why are you allowed to do it? And is it better? Is it preferred to do it? There are there are some circles today, particularly those who follow the Gra, which say you can do it, and that's what they do. And the one who gets the haftorah can't just be, they have to prepare in advance to get the haftorah, or a Bakari reads it. There are some circles which actually do it.
Rabbi Lager, the Kollel, he reads actually roots from the scroll, and also actually Kollel from the scroll, Shiur from the scroll.
So nowadays we have the advent of the printing press,
Yeah.
right? Thanks to Mr. Gutenberg. We have the printing press, and a fascinating Ritva, I think, which says that since the printing press is done by hand, it takes the place of a Sefer Torah, and therefore you have to you would have to since once again it is feasible to have an entire Sefer Torah, you have to read it only from a valid Torah scroll. The reason why we didn't do it, the reason why we don't have it until now is because it's not affordable or it's not easy. Now you have a printing press, it's easy. And he says, even if though the ink is not the same ink used in the Sefer Torah, but you don't need, the ink doesn't make a difference. And even though and he goes through a few different things. And even though it's printed back to back, it's not printed like a scroll, it's still okay. So therefore you would have to use specifically a Sefer, a written nevuah, a written navi. Let's look at what the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. Here's a beautiful website called Shulchan Aruch Harav, which has many halachas about this. It's a known thing. The Rebbes would use the vast majority of the Jewish people use a book of haftorahs that's printed, not rolled up similar to a Sefer Torah. If the haftorah is missing words or letters, it's valid, it's fine, it's like a Megillah, as long as a majority is written properly. Just read the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch inside, and with that we'll move on to the Kuntres Umaayon. Let's look at number Dalet. Afal P. This is Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. This is halachas haftorah. And the brachas is Siman Reish Pei Daled 284. Although you may not, if a Sefer Torah is missing one letter, it is valid, it is puzzle, and you cannot read the Torah from there. When it comes to the haftorah, it does not need to be complete. As long as it's there, you're not allowed to read the haftorah by heart. If you are in a shul which does not have a haftorah, but somebody knows it by heart, you're not allowed to say it by heart. You have to go to a place where there is a haftorah that's written down. You're not allowed to do it by heart because you're not allowed to say oral Torah by heart. You're not supposed to do it. An interesting question would be, let's say it's on a phone, it's on a digital screen, it's not an actual screen. Are you allowed to read it by heart? Are you allowed to read it from the screen? Is it considered to be printed or not? And it's actually very interesting because it doesn't necessarily have to be written on a parchment or printed. If you the Gemara Mesechta Gittin, the bottom of the page, right, talks about how in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple, there was a very wealthy, prominent queen. Her name was Hilni Hamalka. Hileni Hamalka. She was, I think, originally of Greek descent, and she
because like or something.
and she converted to Judaism. Her and all of her sons. They actually found her house where she lives in the old city of Jerusalem, in the city of David. And the Gemara Mesechta Sukkah talks about how every one of her sons had a sukkah, and from there we can learn the size of the sukkah of how big a sukkah has to be. She was very famous. She was 21 years a Nazira. Nazira is one who does not cut their hair, drink wine, or become 21 years. Because she was living in Syria, outside of the Holy Land, and she was a Nazira. She took it upon herself for 7 years to be a Nazira, and after 7 years, she thought she was over. She came to the Beis Hamikdash, Holy Temple, and then they told her, "You can only be a Nazir in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Doesn't work to do it outside of Israel." Because Avir of Eretz Am and Tameh, you're not allowed to become Tameh Lemes, impure to any dead body or anything that touched a dead body, and everything outside of Israel, outside of the Holy Land, is cheskas. It's assumed that it would touch a dead body at one point. You don't know where the cemeteries are, because only the Jewish people have been careful about where they bury people, but not the other nations. So she had to do it another 7 years after she came to Eretz Yisrael, and she was settled in Yerushalayim. At the end of the 7 years, by mistake, she became Tameh, impure. And then you have to redo the entire thing. So she did another 7 years, and only after 21 years did she finally finish her Nazirus.
Third time's a charm.
So Hileni Hamalka, over here on this page, you'll see that she donated to the Beis Hamikdash here. She donated to the Beis Hamikdash, maybe Queen Helene, I don't know. They fashioned a golden tablet as a gift for the Beis Hamikdash, and the Parsha Soita. A Soita is a woman who, etc., went through this before. A woman who her husband suspects her of being unfaithful with a certain man, tells her not to be alone with that man. 2 witnesses who saw that she spent a significant amount of time alone with that person, and she goes for the test in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Kohen would write the scroll, or write on a parchment letters, the words of the parsha, the Torah portion of the Soita in the base, and he would write it on a parchment and erase it in water in the Beis Hamikdash, erasing Hashem's name. Hashem's name in the water gave it the special power, and then the woman had to drink it, and if she drank it, if she was innocent, nothing would happen to her, and she would get blessings. If she was guilty, she would die a very unnatural death. So the Kohen, when he would write down the parsha of the Sota, the words of the Sota, he would copy it from a golden tablet in the Beis Hamikdash. He wouldn't do it from memory. He wouldn't copy from a Sefer Torah. He would copy it from a golden tablet. So we see that not necessarily does it have to be your typical ink and typical paper or parchment or another surface. Even in a golden tablet where the words were engraved, it's also considered to be a writing. So maybe a phone will be the same thing. So if the only thing that person had was a phone, maybe they could do they could say the haftorah from there. But if, for example, you're in a shul and there's a Sefer Torah there, but there's no Sefer of haftorahs, you cannot do the haftorah from memory. What must be done is that 10 people from the shul leave and go to another shul and read the haftorah over there. But it cannot be said from memory. The Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch will now go through all the reasons why we should have a haftorah written, the Nevi and the prophets written like in the Torah scroll, and then he negates the reasons one by one. Even you can read haftorah even if it's not written on parchment from the hide of a kosher animal, like the halachas, like it was done during the times of the Gemara or the Mishnah, where they had a proper parchment for a Torah scroll material with haftorahs written. You're able to use it for the haftorah. Haftorah niskana klal shekruah b'sefer kasher. They never, when the sages said that you must read the haftorah, they never said it should be done from a kosher sefer Torah. It could be done even from a non-kosher sefer Torah, just from a chapter book. And although in the times of the Gemara, one was not allowed to write just one chapter of a book, you have to write an entire book of Tanakh. But because there's no other way, therefore they're allowed to write just the part of the haftorah. Not every single person was able, not every congregation or every shul was able to purchase their own set or procure their own set of the entire Navi written on parchment. And then they're going to stop reading the haftorah. Can't do it by heart because it's part of the Tanakh. And they couldn't afford, every shul couldn't afford their own book of Navi. So therefore they allowed everyone to have their own sefer just of the haftorah, which is more affordable. Nowadays we have, present age, we have the invention of the printing press. And it's not expensive to buy a book of haftarahs. You don't say you must have the entire Tanakh. There are some places which read from a Tanakh, but the majority of places don't. They read from a book of haftarahs. Because you're anyways only doing it as a heter. Because the reason why you're not doing it from an actual written parchment scroll is because of the sages allowed it, because there's no other way. So reading from paper is the same thing. If it's not written on kosher hide of a kosher animal, and it's not print, and it's not rolled up like a sefer Torah, you're doing it only because the sages allowed it, and therefore it could be allowed even if it's not a complete book. So you don't need a nach. It could be just the haftarahs themselves. And if you're missing some words or letters, or if it's written wrong, because many times you have what's called a kri and a ksiv, the way it's written and the way it's pronounced. It's pronounced differently than it's written. So and many of the sefer haftarahs, they only bring the kri. The person reading it, they don't want to confuse them, and they bring merely only the kri, the way it is read out loud, without the ksiv, not the way it is written. So it's missing a word. And seemingly you're reading a word by heart. Then, still could do it by heart. Because it's just one word, it's fine. You're allowed to quote a word, even a pasuk, even a verse by heart. But generally, more than a pasuk from Tanakh, you're not supposed to say by heart. And therefore, since everything is printed nowadays, right? You're able to also have haftarahs from different portions and different sections entirely, and there's no issues whatsoever. And so with that, we will pause for today. And